I get a lot of questions about the Net Bible. 2 years ago, at the Evangelical Theological Society, the publishers of the Net Bible, Thomas Nelson, generously gave me a copy of the Net Bible Full Notes Edition for me to review. Today, we talk about that translation on this episode of Ancient Egypt and the Bible. Okay, the Net Bible is a new translation, and it promises a translation that is designed with the modern reader in mind, but with full transparency of the decisions made by the translation committee. The version I am reviewing is the Full Notes edition that has 3 sets of notes: the translator notes, text critical notes, and study notes. Now, even though they gave me this for free, there has been no strings placed on me reviewing this. Okay, so all the opinions I am giving you, I'm not paid to do this review. Any of the opinions that you get about this are my own opinions. Okay, as I said, I'm not being paid for this, and there's been no strings placed upon me reviewing this. So you're getting the full Dr. Falk opinion here. All right. So with that said, what we're going to do is rate this translation and its 3 sets of notes separately, since you can get various editions of the Net Bible with differing set of notes. But it was really handy to be able to have them all in one place. Okay? So let's start with the first category, which is the translation itself. The translation is a dynamic equivalence translation. I will say this: the New Testament translation is better than the Old Testament when it comes to just a matter of translation. Now, the translation committee is small, and it's not without its ideological bent. Many of the members tend to lean what I would say is very evangelical conservative in view. There's some of the members are more on the lines of being fundamentalist in perspective. Now, what I will say about the translation itself is I think overall it's a good balance between dynamic equivalence and formal equivalence. And for those for those of you who don't know the difference, a dynamic equivalence translation, you read the text in its original language, you figure out what it means, and then you put that out. Whereas, say, a formal equivalence keeps very, very careful tracking of syntax, grammar. It's much more based upon what does the text say in a kind of a literal fashion. So I think that it does lean more towards dynamic equivalence. And I think that is really important. But there's also some advantages too that they've tried to do in the translation that I think is really good. They've tried to explain some of the idioms, and I think that's really a positive thing for the translation. So they've tried to work in what an idiom actually means in the translation. It doesn't follow that the translation itself does not seem to follow, say, the latest advances or the latest thinking in translation method. It tends to be a much more traditional translation as far as grammatical structures go. And unfortunately, it still largely depends upon traditional renderings that you often find in Bible translations. So it's not anywhere near as cutting edge as, say, the International Standard Version, but it's also a good alternative as a study Bible for, say, when you compare it to, say, the NIV or even the ESV. So I think the translation itself stands up well to say those more popular versions of the Bible, at least as far as translation goes. One other thing I liked about the translation was it tends to avoid the more controversial aspects of recent translational methodology. Like, for example, translating every bait clause as a subordinate clause, as an introductory subordinate clause, which a lot of modern translations are now doing, and I have some issues with that. But overall, the translation of the NET is a good translation, and I would give it a score of 7 out of 10. Not the best translation I've ever encountered, not my favorite Bible translation, but it's a good Bible translation. It's a very good Bible translation. Okay. Next category we're going to talk about is the Translators Notes. Basically, it gives you a look into the decisions and the choices that the translators made. And I wish every Bible had this. I think this is the best part of the NET. It's those translator notes. I love translator notes. I think overall, this is the best feature of the Bible. By and large, it's the best feature of this version, is the translator notes. I think the translator notes are excellent. Okay? And I wish every single Bible had this. Now, there is some room for criticism here. Sometimes the translators overstate their cases for their choices, or they don't give you a good justification of why they're translating it in a way. They just more or less say that's what they did. So the translator's notes will show you what they did and the choices they made. And every translator has to make choices. That's just something that comes with being a translator. You aren't going to translate it always or with every nuance. So a good translator, though, makes good judicious choices. However, I think their justification for some of those choices is too strongly stated. So this is, as I say, this is fantastic that they have translator notes at all. As I say, I wish every Bible had this. But that said, I think some of the choices the translators make and some of their justifications in the translation notes are overstated as to how strong they are. So for that, I would give this a good 8 out of 10. Easily. 8 out of 10, no problem. In fact, I had originally given it 9 out of 10 until I started reading some of the justifications, which sort of dropped it down a point for me. But this could have easily been, this is easily the best feature of the Bible. The next aspect we're going to look at is the text critical notes. Now, I like text critical notes. And I think again, every Bible should have text critical notes. But in the case of the Net Bible, there are some glaring omissions on important text variances. And again, this is more of a problem with the Old Testament than the New Testament. The New Testament doesn't seem to have this problem nearly as much in the translation as, say, the translation of the Old Testament. Many of the most important text variants from, like, just for example, the Septuagint, are absent in the text critical notes. For example, there's no note on, say, the 440 years of 1 Kings 6:1 that you find in the Septuagint. You would think for a text which many consider to be a really important text that you'd want to include text critical notes that cover all the most important variants, the ones that are possible and meaningful. Again, I think this is just one of those things where they focused on the translation, and that's a good thing. and then they sort of added these text critical notes after the fact, and I just don't think it was done with the same care and attention the translator's notes received. So I'm going to give the text critical notes 6 out of 10. Next is the study notes. This is by far the weakest portion of this edition. The study notes are doctrinaire and oftentimes very, very poorly supported. This is where sort of the biases of the translators really sort of come out, is in the study notes. And if you're looking for a version of the Bible that sort of fits as a study Bible, this is a really, really poor substitute for that. If you want a good study Bible, get yourself a good study Bible. Don't use the study notes from the net for this. They're just not good. They're not good. They don't reflect recent scholarship. In fact, the bibliography has entries so old that they're mummified. Let me read through a bit of the bibliography for you, and then you kind of get a feel for this. And the sort of the way biblical scholarship works these days is that citations that are older than 50 years old are considered to be out of date. But some of these are going back into the 19th century. So, you've got to really sort of look at this and you're going, what the heck? Like, for example, you've got S.R. Driver here as part of their citations. From 1892. They quote Driver's Book of Exodus from 1911. You got a text from Engel from 1955. That's not great. Quote John Garstang on Judges and Joshua from 1931. That's a book that is so obsolete it isn't even funny. Alexander Heidel from 1946. L.W. King, Chronicles Concerning Early Babylonian Kings, including records of early history of the Kassites and the country of the sea. 1907. Frederick Denison Maurice, Doctrine of Sacrifice deduced from Scriptures. 1893. So that's just a sampling here, but it's really characteristic of the bibliography of cited works. It's not using current scholarship. In fact, there's very little scholarship in there from, say, the last 10 years. So I think that's kind of problematic. And it shows in the study notes, and to some extent it shows in the translation too. So again, I think this is one of the things where the translation committee, as again, particularly for the Old Testament, was not up on their scholarship when they did this translation or the study notes. So I think the study notes is by far the weakest portion of this edition. I'd give it 4 out of 10. They're not good. They're not good. Okay, let's finally talk about the print quality, because I've got a number of things to say about the print quality. Now, Thomas Nelson uses a condensed serif font, and here's an example of the text. I'll move it up to the screen here. It's really tight text. It's a really small point. Okay, the main text here is in 9-point font. That's really small. And the notes are in 7-point. Oh yeah, 7-point font. This is not a Bible for those who are visually impaired. Okay? If you are visually impaired, you're going to have a rough go with this Bible. Yeah, you're going to need a magnifying glass for that. Even I'm very short-sighted. I am finding this hard to read. Okay? Your eyes will hurt after reading this because the typeface is so small. Now, Thomas Nelson designed this particular condensed serif font so it is still readable at those smaller typefaces, but it is very, very small. But then again, too, what they did was they've tried to do the put the kitchen sink into this. So they have compromised that kitchen sink approach by using a small typeface. Yeah, so it's you will want a magnifying glass. Now, the other thing is the paper quality is off gray, slightly translucent, so there is serious bleed through. Right? Hope you can see this, but you can actually see the text bleed through from the back of the page. So that can be distracting to some readers. Now, it's not the worst bleed through I have seen in a Bible printing, okay? But having any at all is distracting. So that's not great. As I said, it's not the worst I've seen. I've got an NASB where it's much worse. But I prefer a completely opaque paper where there's no bleed through at all. Yeah, it could be twice the size. Yeah, that's one of the trade-offs. But a higher quality paper though could be, but then that increased printing costs. So there's the trade-off is you could have a bigger edition, prevent bleed through, or a higher quality of paper, which increase the price of the volume. And from what I understand, it's already a pretty expensive volume. The other thing is they did have some nice touches on it that I really liked. I love the fact they do the metallic edging, the metallic dusting of the cut, and that does show quality. It's a good quality print job overall. The leather on the volume is stitched on the edges. It's not glued. All right. So there's a slight defect on some of the stitching, but it's actually stitched, and that's good. All right. I like that. I think it shows that they took time to do some of the little things that make for nice to handle, nice to hold, nice to carry. It feels good in the hand. It's a good feeling Bible in the hand. I also liked that it has 3 ribbon markers. I like that. So, I mean, typically you might get 1 in a Bible. You're lucky 2. I've never seen one with 3. Oh, really, basically a New Testament and 2 for the Old Testament. So that's a really nice to have, and they're different colors. They're red, yellow, and blue. So I like that feature. They really went and did a huge quality boost for the exterior of it. This is meant to be a gift edition, so gift editions do tend to be a little on the higher end. So, but it's really nice how they did the exterior. It would absolutely make a lovely gift. Overall, I'm going to give the print quality on this I think we'll be a little more generous on this one. We'll give this an 8 out of 10. The only real problems I have with it is the small size of the font. That font is really small. 7-point font on a printed edition is really hard. And even for the main text, where it's 9-point, I mean, it's not unusual these days for books to have 10-point font. In my novels, and you can kind of see the text of that size, that's 11-point. 11-point is not a large edition. That's just for a fairly standard font size. So I would have expected in a Bible for the main text to have been at least 10-point. But I think what they're doing here by making it 9-point is basically, it would be really glaring if they did the main text in 10-point and then the study notes in 7. So by reducing the size of the main text to 9-point, they make the 7-point font less glaring. So it does get a demerit for the font size. There's just no way around that. You understand the reasons. It's just really hard to read, especially when you start reading it in the Hebrew. They have portions of the notes in Hebrew, and that's really difficult to read. if I was to do this edition over, I would get rid of the study notes first of all. And that sort of gets us to our final thoughts on this. The Net Bible tries to strike a balance between literal and thought translations. And I think given current available translations, the Net Bible does definitely leans more towards a dynamic translation than a formal equivalence one. I would say that where, say, the Christian Standard Bible is more of a middle of the road compromise between dynamic and literal translations, the Net tends to lean more towards the dynamic translations. On the plus side, the Net Bible explains euphemisms and idioms, and that's really, really good. I'm really happy that the translators explain those a lot of euphemisms and idioms. However, the translators also lack the courage to go against traditional readings, for example, the Red Sea. The translators' notes are less circumspect than they should be at times, and the study notes contain biases of certain committee members and are woefully out of date as far as their scholarship goes. If I was to make a recommendation for, say, a second edition of this, what I would basically advise them to do is scrap the study notes, scrap and sort of improve, keep the text critical notes, improve upon that. That way, if they got rid of the study notes, they could increase the point size of the font to something that's readable, and I think that would be overall a better way to do this. Overall, the Net Study Bible, full text notes by Thomas Nelson, is a good addition. It's a good translation. It's really helpful in places. I think overall it's well worth your money. It's well worth the money. It's well worth the purchase. I think the New Testament is better than the Old Testament, but I also think too that you could do a lot worse. You could do a whole lot worse. Overall, I'll give it a 7 out of 10. Okay, not the best full notes edition Bible I've ever encountered. Certainly not the worst. Translation's good. The translator notes are good. The actual care the publisher put into the physical artifact of the book is good. I think it's well worth having on your bookshelf. So, I hope you found that review, that concise review of the Net Bible Full Notes Edition by Thomas Nelson to be interesting, and I hope you'll learn something. Thank you very much for watching this book review, and we will see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.